Hello, today I'm reviewing the Xlite Wireless V2 Founders Edition from Pulsar. This mouse has been surprisingly good for me. Normally I'm not much of a fan of these big slanted ergo designs. They're alright and I have actually used them a lot, but I always do prefer low and flat buttons. So while the OG Xlite and Xlite Wireless were always on my radar, I never actually picked them up for myself. And the V2's announcement had me pretty underwhelmed. But sure enough, excitement was building around this mouse coming up to its release, and it did seem like they were making all the right changes. Moving over to completely solid sides, and of course fixing the weight balance, seemed like absolute no-brainer decisions, but it's still good to see them make improvements. There was also great feedback on the early samples they sent out. It seemed nearly universally positive. Plus, this green colorway just looks so clean. So I had to give it a shot to see for myself what all the fuss is about. And after a few weeks of pretty solid use, I am very glad I took the risk, because it has been an extremely enjoyable experience for me. It is still, of course, a big and clunky ergo, so it's not quite ideal, but this is certainly how to do this design style right. It is combining aspects of my favorite ergo shapes, the EC2, and especially the outside AX in a way that is highly balanced. It is an exemplar of what I personally want in an ergo and what I think they should strive to be. It is just so well executed. And the feature set, of course, is incredible. 60-gram wireless is the truth. So many new upcoming mice are getting it at this point that it is starting to become standard, and I am all for it. In fact, it's so common now that it's getting hard for me to use anything else. I still do, of course, enjoy my Zowies and Vaxies, but it is getting harder and harder for me to justify using them when mice like these exist. I have truly been getting spoiled. Then finally, the actual quality on display here with this mouse is incredible as well. It is genuinely premium, which is quite crazy for the asking price of only $80 here. It seems unbeatable as the go-to value option. What you get for what you pay for is unmatched. So overall, it's quite hard not to recommend this mouse, really. It's just that good. I've been so surprised that it's become one of my recent go-tos. This mouse just really came out of nowhere. And now it easily gets my highest recommendations, especially for you ergo fans. It does not get much better than this. And for everyone else too, this may actually turn you into an ergo believer. I know it did for me. But you should still be as informed as possible before picking this mouse up, so we'll be breaking this down in detail. Of course, starting with the shape, because this is what will make or break this mouse. Everything else is near perfect, but the shape is going to be highly preferential. Its overall design is of course modeled after the legendary Zowie EC2, and it will retain that classic ergo flavor that you know and have possibly came to love. Both mice have slanted buttons and tops, which very naturally puts your hand at more of an angle when you grip it and encourages tilting your wrist. This will end up reducing tension during normal use through enabling more wrist movement, as opposed to flat grips that will end up stressing your joints comparatively more. These asymmetric curves also follows the natural shape of your hand to give very even support throughout, almost completely filling your hand with minimal effort, which will provide a very high degree of stability, and encouraging more forward placed fingers, which will relax the muscles in the rest of your hand. This grip style that encourages all parts of your arm and hand to be as relaxed as possible is quite polarizing, and will truly be a love it or hate it type thing. And personally, I'm pretty mixed. I do feel that the additional support that this larger amount of palm contact brings, and the lower tension from this more relaxed grip style, does add a lot of consistency to my play. I don't end up jittering as much, so crossbar placement is much more consistent overall. And the relaxed muscles are much more calm, so I see a reduction in choking during tense situations. These benefits also of course carry over to the Xlite, and in the past few weeks this mouse has felt great. It's been extremely reliable and remarkably consistent, which really is what you should be looking forward to, so it has performed quite well. But back to the EC2, this mouse in particular can feel pretty awkward in games sometimes. This is because the mouse that makes this much palm contact is actually a little bit uncomfortable for me, and can end up becoming distracting. This is largely due to just personal preference, since I am used to more ambi options that fill out the edges of my palm as opposed to this middle portion. So when I do go to something that fills out my hand so totally and so completely, it will bring me out of my comfort zone into a place that I'm not much of a fan of. And also these very relaxed grips can sometimes be to their detriment and be overly relaxed, which can lead to laziness. It doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes I do notice myself falling into this trap of just swiping around my arm without really much of a purpose, as opposed to a smaller, more nimble mouse that forces me to always be on point. So overall the EC2 was always a bit of a mixed bag, where it did excel in some very specific circumstances, but overall it had things that held it back and kept it from becoming a go-to option for me. Here is where the outside AX comes in to solve some of these issues with the EC2 by using a slightly different shape. Most importantly, the back of the mouse here is far more bulbous feeling, and is relatively much flatter right in the area where your palm makes contact. This helps make room in this middle area of your palm so it doesn't feel invasive at all. And this is also more typical of the ambis that I do greatly prefer, so this is much appreciated on the outset. However, these taller buttons and slightly wider grip can make the outside AX feel a little bit less precise, so generally my aim is worse overall on this mouse than the EC2. Oddly enough, the EC2 is actually a bit of an aim chain or demon for me personally, while the Outside X is not at all actually. It's quite bad in that. But I do feel that this more bulbous back helps normalize the experience a little bit, and helps it feel a little bit more rounded and versatile in all situations. So it's not quite as extreme or as volatile as the EC2 can sometimes feel for me, which I do feel has led to me enjoying the Outside X slightly more in-game overall. This is great for the Xlite, since it does actually feel very similar to the Outside AX in hand. Actually, shockingly similar. I am very surprised how close they are. The very first thing I thought to myself the moment I put my hand on the Xlite right after taking it out of the box was, whoa, this is literally just the outset. It is crazy close. They both end up having the same flat area right on top of the hump that reduces contact in the middle of your palm and lets you breathe a little bit, since again, it is not as invasive. Also, this will allow you to incorporate your fingers into your aim a little bit more, since you do have some more room to pull them around in your hand, as opposed to the EC2 that just kind of sticks its way in there and restricts you. The front of both these mice is also the same. They both have those high buttons and wide grip, with seemingly the exact same dimensions. This part of the mouse in particular is actually something that I do quite dislike about the Outside AX. It ends up making the mice feel a little bit too bulky and hard to correct with. I can still aim fine with this mouse and perform well in game, since its very short and stubby design does allow you to incorporate your fingers a lot throughout their entire range of motion, but it is still not ideal, and I would vastly prefer this mouse if it did have a smaller front. But on the Xlite, this bulky front does not feel nearly as bad, because 60 grams plus glass feet mitigates this issue heavily. Its low weight heavily reduces inertia, and glass always has near zero static friction, so it is very easy to correct with this mouse. And even the smallest amount of finger force gets it moving, so it is not nearly as restrictive as the Outside AX feels. A mouse's feature set can quite drastically change how it feels in use, so it is always something that is very important to consider. You can't really view any aspect of a mouse, whether it be shape or other features, in a vacuum, and you must instead consider how it interacts with the entire package as a whole in order to get an idea of how it affects the experience. You must always be intersectional. Alright, now onto where the Xlite starts to falter a little bit, and that is this back portion here. This is another part of the design that closely takes after the EC2, where you can see them take this approach of slowly tapering off to the pad with a tip at the end. This does help the mouse to make contact all the way through to the very bottom of your palm, which does give you my full hand experience, which can actually be quite comfy, and I can see why some people would prefer this. But for me, I'm not a fan of this at all, because it ends up causing these issues of the mouse impacting the heel of your hand during vertical finger motions. This will end up drastically reducing your overall vertical range of motion unless you are willing to incorporate your entire arm. Whereas on the Outside AX, this back is completely cut off, so you have total freedom and can really do just whatever you want with your fingers. Also, this more cut off back makes the end hit a little bit higher in your palm, and it is also, of course, more rounded, so it is again more bulbous feeling. This will end up making the Xlite have a slightly different hand feel than the Outset, but is really only in this one area. Everything else is nearly identical and about as close as you can get to a clone. Just be aware you will miss a little bit of that rounding right here. But unlike with the EC2, I don't actually end up feeling that this back is completely detrimental, because again, the feature set here changes how the mouse performs overall drastically. In comparison, lightweight wireless is much more maneuverable, so it is far easier to use your entire arm, and I don't notice it being as fatiguing or annoying to do. I did of course have to adjust a little bit because that is not what I naturally do. I am definitely a finger aimer, but it was still learnable for me after about a week or two of use. Then I stopped noticing it, and it's fine honestly, now that I am able to lock out my hand and incorporate a lot more of my arm. So the main story of the Xlite here is that the entire feature set is very important to consider, even when the shape is mainly a rehashing of the old classics. In fact, it so drastically changes how the mouse performs that it allowed it to become a top mouse for me personally, despite it being an ergo. You may have noticed on my previous top mice list, they were all flat button designs, because those are just what I drastically prefer. But if I were to make it again, this would absolutely crack onto the list. It would still come in low because it's still not truly mainable. My main will likely always be reserved for a flat button mouse, but it has been too good for me lately to completely leave it off of a list. It is that good. And anytime I've wanted a more consistent and comfortable option, it has been there for me and has never disappointed. It is truly the perfect second fiddle, and is an excellent change of pace from what I'm used to. It's still not perfect as a whole though, and there is definite room for improvement here. For example, I still do prefer the Outset shape, because it just does not have this issue in the back. Again, it's not a big deal on this mouse in particular, but it could still be better, so room for improvement there. A 60-gram wireless Outside AX would just be absolutely god tier, but this is a good compromise and it's close enough for me. And likely close enough for most other Outside AX fans too. I think they should all appreciate this, because it is as close as you'll likely ever get. I really don't see Vaxi making a mouse like this anytime soon. But even beyond the Outside AX, there is still a lot of room for improvement. After all, that mouse is just a personal favorite, but again, not a mainable option. That is why I'm very excited for the upcoming Mini. With the EC3 that I have here, Zowie is able to prove the value of these shorter in length ergos. They do allow you to curl your fingers much more aggressively into a claw grip, which does help you feel more locked in and ends up reducing that overly relaxed style that I talked about earlier. Which I do feel that helps me to be much less lazy with the EC3 than I am with the EC2 and Outset. Also, this reduced length greatly increases your vertical range of motion, since it is much harder to pinch your hand. It still does happen, of course, because this point is still prevalent, but this mouse is so short it's really not going to happen unless you're pulling all the way back. But despite these improvements, the EC2 actually still never rose above those other two options, because mainly it felt a little too bulky in the front still. After all, it is just a squished down EC2, not an entirely scaled down one, so it has the same exact front end that is both wide and quite high. So just like the Outset, it doesn't quite feel the most precise. A fully scaled down mouse like the Xlite Mini should feel great because it will also have a slimmer front, not just a squished design. Of course, the feature set of the Xlite does reduce the issues of these bulkiness, but it is still just a band-aid and it doesn't actually fix anything. It just covers it up and makes it less of an issue. So a smaller front should actually fix this. I already have an order placed for the Mini and my shipment is on the way, and I'm really looking forward to it. I really think that it has the potential to bring back that aggressive feel that I love of these low front ambies to an ergo design. Which actually leads me to Pulsar's next upcoming mice, their ambi options, the X2 and X2 Mini. I am particularly excited for these because really what I want out of the Xlite Mini is more of an ambi feel, so you might as well go all the way instead of just compromising. And from what we've seen, it looks pretty nice. They do appear to have very low buttons, which is always fantastic because these feel so responsive, especially when you combine them with a low weight design. And it also seems to have a moderate hump. It's kind of hard to tell based on the images they've shown us, but I really like rear humps personally, so I want to believe it does. But even if it doesn't, I have been coming around to the flatter, more FK style shapes, so I don't think that would be a deal breaker. So based on what we've seen of the X2, it should be an absolute banger, since the only thing that I could really realistically improve about the Xlite is its shape. Everything else is extremely high quality. They got that part down. The build quality and overall feel of this mouse is impressively premium, especially for the price. It is rock solid and genuinely feels great in hand, which is insane for an $80 wireless mouse. I expected much worse, honestly. It still isn't flawless, and there are a lot of things about this mouse that could be slightly tuned. Like for example, the holes in the front here are just plain weird. They end up occurring right where I grip, and this is a very common grip style, so I know a lot of people do this and will run into the holes. So it's just a strange decision. But the holes are so small and well shaped that it doesn't actually bother me like other honeycomb designs do. This type of thing will be a common theme here with the Xlite. Nothing besides the build quality is really that great, but nothing is actually bad either. It's just the little stuff that needs a little bit of cleaning up. Like the coating, for example, feels premium, but is not the most grippy. It ends up feeling like a blend between the raw plastic finishes of something like Razor Mice and the more slightly rubberized GPX and Evaxi coatings that I would probably best describe as feeling slightly chalky. Of course, since it does take after the raw plastic finishes, it will start to slip around a little bit when sweat starts to build up, so I would of course like to see a more rubberized finish here. But in hand, it feels great and is quite satisfying to the touch. This also does do a great deal to make the mouse feel more quality in hand, so it is always something that is very important to consider. Coating is always what interacts with your hand the most, so it has a very large impact on the mouse's overall feel of quality. Like Logitech mice, for example, are always just on the next level, because the slight rubberized coating they have just feels so good. And the Xlite almost has like a baby version of this coating, so it holds up. Now onto the clicks, again they have the same story. Good, but not great. The actual tactile bump itself feels quite good. KL 8.0s are solid as always, and they give the clicks a very satisfyingly chunky quality. But as you probably noticed, they use a connected shell design here, which is as awful as always. You will certainly start to feel it introduce some awful mushiness. Right before and right after the click, the plastic clearly flexes, and it's just not good. Separated shells eliminates this issue completely, and I've never experienced it on a good design, so this is quite disappointing here. But in game, they feel great, and I honestly have no legitimate complaints to make about them. The latency is fantastic. By the way, you should download the software to lower the debounce. It's super easy. This is actually the best software I've ever used, and the 0 millisecond has 0 issues. And the tactile bump is so crisp that it helps their click timing. It feels great in game, and I have just, again, 0 problems with it. It just could be better. Again, on the ambi, there should be a great improvement here because it does show that the clicks are separated. They have already nailed the actual switch implementation, so all they need is a better design, so it should be great. Now on the scroll, again, it's just decent, and what I would describe as being highly inoffensive. There are certainly defined steps, so you do get a feeling of tactility, but it is quite loosely tensioned, so it is not as crisp as I would like. I certainly would prefer if the scroll was tighter like vacuum wheels are or the Bolt. Also, it is actually so loose that you can get stuck in between steps sometimes and get ghost inputs. This has never actually happened in-game, only during browsing, so again, non-issue. But it can happen, so be aware. Also, it is the quietest wheel I've ever used, so if that's important for you, then here you go. Now onto these side buttons, easily the worst part about this mouse, but they're still not that bad actually. They end up having a very hollow, pretty unsatisfying feel to them, since I think they use these weird switches, so they do feel somewhat cheap. But it still isn't horrid since there is minimal pre and post travel, so it's not mushy or anything, which is usually what bothers me the most about side buttons. It's just extremely hollow and very unsatisfying. Very mediocre side buttons overall, but usable. Now onto the interesting part, these glass skates that come with the Founders Edition. Superglides have actually been quite polarizing lately, because there have been reports of people having issues with wear after long-term use. This is because these skates are made out of coated aluminosilicate, and over time the coating will start to wear, which exposes the material underneath. This will of course slow the skates significantly, and one of the appeals of glass is the speed that they offer, so this is a pretty big deal for some people. But the much worse part is that this material is extremely abrasive, so rubbing them directly against a pad can ruin it. And these hybrid surfaces in particular suffer, since it will level out the surface and make it feel quite muddy. This is obviously a huge concern because it is just an insane design flaw to have, but it is not the end of the world. Because personally, I haven't had these issues at all with my own copy of them. Now, by no means have I put an insane amount of hours on this mouse. Again, it has been only my secondary the past month, but in this time it has not changed significantly. So in general, it does seem that these new batches are less susceptible to these issues, and most concerns were with the original models. Now, you don't see as much coating wear, but I have still seen some people complain about it, so it's likely copy dependent. Of course, buyer beware, you should be aware and knowledgeable of these risks. And still, these glass skates will slow down a pretty good amount without any coating wear occurring, since glass is far more sensitive to oils and grime building up and affecting how the surface feels. After all, Lethal Skates V2, like I have here, have actually slowed down far more than Superglides, and they aren't coated at all. It is just what happens with the glass. It's very sensitive. But I actually do not think this is a bad thing at all, and I really do personally prefer how they feel broken in versus fresh. Since even after a lot of use, they still do always retain that low static friction. Of course, as long as the actual coating is intact, if that wears, it'll go muddy on you. But as long as that stays intact, it'll stay very low. But after slowdown, it'll gain much more dynamic friction. Far more than even some of the slowest PTFE feet actually. They will get genuinely slow, which will give a great amount of stopping power. It'll help you out a lot with braking your mouse, just like with a slow pad. And glass always does come to a very clean stopping point since the glide is so smooth, so it is very controllable overall once you break them in. It really is quite an excellent combination of low static friction for these small adjustments and high dynamic friction for that excellent stopping power. It's a great balance that I really enjoy. It's one of those things that's probably not going to be for everybody, but I do think that everybody should try. So lately, I have been really having a good time with glass feet. I have Superglides on this, of course, and also the NP01S, both of which have felt great. You really do want either low weight or a very controllable shape to work with glass feet. It'll really help them feel more controllable, so both these mice are the perfect fit. Plus, like I said, I am running Lethal V2s on the Starlight 12, and I do actually prefer these over Superglides, because they do end up keeping a little bit more of the tactility of the pad while still being smooth, so they are very satisfying to use. And the dynamic friction is crazy high. They slow down way more than Superglides, so it is a perfect fit for such a light wireless mouse. Overall, I still do prefer PTFE since they offer a much more consistent experience, especially with these core pad controls. They are my new favorite feet by far, I feel. The higher static friction in general of PTFE just helps me feel far less jittery, because even once you get used to glass, it can get pretty sketchy at times. But on PTFE, always locked in, always comfortable. It's great. And you could also use them on a much wider variety of pads. For example, I've been using the Sarah pad a lot lately, and obviously glass on ceramic is just horrific. Would not recommend it. And PTFE also keeps the differences between mousepad surfaces, whereas glass kind of tends to smooth everything out and always have zero static friction, so it'll make pads a little bit boring and kind of too normalized sometimes, which is particularly relevant for me since I am someone who enjoys pads a lot and, of course, reviews them. So glass will never replace PTFE for me. You just can't be the gold standard, simple as. But I will still always keep a mouse with glass in rotation since it's just too fun not to, and it really does open up some cool opportunities for customizing your experience. In conclusion, the Xlite V2 is an absolute banger of a mouse. It is not perfect for me, still do prefer flat buttoned mice, but it is turning me into an ergo believer, and I do find myself slowly sliding up the ergosexual Kinsey scale. And anyone that is actually into ergos should absolutely pick this up, especially when you consider the price here. You really just can't go wrong. Personally though, what I'm really looking forward to are getting Pulsar's next mice on hand. I cannot wait for my Mini to get delivered in the next couple of days, and of course the X2 looks so nice. Seriously, these specs and a small ambi mouse sounds so crazy good. X2 Mini new main? Question mark? Shocking? Alright, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.